Early morning inside the lavish top-floor office of Carter Corporation, David Carter sat staring out the window. Sunlight streamed through the pristine glass walls, yet it couldn't dispel the heaviness clouding his thoughts. The success he had built seemed no longer enough to silence the unease creeping in from every corner. David was the epitome of a successful CEO. Young, brilliant, ambitious, and consistently on top. His company was ranked among the most formidable players in the industry. From the outside, everything appeared perfect. But deep down, there was a disquiet he could no longer ignore. For months, David had sensed something was off. Even though the company continued to thrive, something intangible was slipping out of his control. There were strange glances, suspicious stares from lower-level staff, and murmurs in the hallway he could never fully catch. A gap was forming between him and the people he was supposed to lead. This wasn't simple burnout. It was a gut feeling, as if something was being hidden in the corners of the company. Something he could never see from the height of his position, where everything was curated and sanitized for the eyes of the CEO. Then, during a routine senior executive meeting, a minor report triggered something David couldn't shake. Rachel, the head of human resources, mentioned a peculiar case involving Lucy, a longtime employee. Lucy had suddenly resigned without explanation, and her colleagues were equally in the dark. When David pressed for more, Daniel, a senior manager, brushed it off and avoided details. A wave of suspicion surged inside David. Something wasn't right, and this time, he wasn't going to let it slide. He realized he could no longer rely solely on reports or the curated insights of those around him. He needed to see things from a different perspective, one not clouded by status or protocol. His decision didn't come from a detailed strategy, but rather an overwhelming urge. He would go undercover. He would shed the suit, strip away the respect and deference given to someone in his position. He would immerse himself in the company as just another employee, to get closer to the truth. David knew that if he wanted to uncover what was really happening, he had to go to the place no CEO ever looked from. The next morning, he dressed simply: light blue shirt, jeans, sneakers, an outfit no one at Carter Corporation had ever seen him in. He told no one about the plan. He just walked into the building like any other worker. In his new appearance, David entered the operations department. He was quickly assigned to the warehouse, a section of the company where the most overlooked employees worked. This was where he would begin. Every step through the warehouse felt foreign. Forklifts rumbled, crates towered in corners, and tired workers moved with quiet intensity. Nothing like the world he knew from the C-suite. He could feel the tension in the air, the heavy looks, the unease behind every movement. It was a different world from the polished luxury of his CEO office. Some ignored him completely. Others gave wary stares. David couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong here. He had never known this sensation from the summit of leadership, where everything felt under control and easily managed. Throughout the day, David simply observed, quietly listening to hushed conversations. Some stories stuck with him: workers doing unpaid overtime, managers verbally abusing staff who missed deadlines, and a consistent undercurrent of fear when anyone spoke of corporate decisions. By the end of the day, he returned to his hotel room near the company, his mind racing. He couldn't shake what he had seen. These were hard-working people, enduring struggle and neglect, while those upstairs focused only on profits and spreadsheets. One image haunted him: Lucy, a warehouse worker, pushing through overtime shifts alone without help. She looked exhausted, sleep-deprived. When David asked how she was doing, she smiled faintly and said, "It's just work." That moment squeezed his heart. There was something deeper happening here, something that went beyond a single resignation. Back in his hotel room, David was consumed by thoughts. He knew this journey was just beginning, but what he had seen in just one day already changed how he saw everything. Did this company really care about its employees? And could he, one man, change a system so built on power and silence? He understood clearly now. If he wanted the truth, he would have to keep going, with relentless determination. But the question still lingered. Would he have the courage to expose everything and transform it from the inside out? David Carter woke up the next morning with a different kind of feeling. Sunlight filtered through the large hotel window, But it wasn't enough to ease the weight pressing on his chest. He had finally done what he felt he needed to do. The night before, as he reflected on everything he had witnessed, he could no longer deny that his company was harboring serious problems, ones he had never paid attention to. As the CEO of one of the largest companies in the industry, he had always stood at the top, where everything seemed polished, respected, and admired. But since going undercover as a regular employee, David had felt the difference in the company's atmosphere like a shock to the system. He was no longer the powerful boss. He was just another worker. No authority, no shield, no reverence. All he had now were unfamiliar eyes, curious stares, and occasional whispers of suspicion from those around him. With each step, each passing day, David could feel the tension in the company growing more evident. Although the company maintained its status on paper, the environment below was a stark contrast to what he knew from the executive floor. Sighs, hurried gestures, and even the frustrated looks exchanged between employees made it clear. Something was wrong. But what disturbed David the most was the change in behavior among the senior managers. He couldn't help but notice a blatant disparity in how employees were treated. While office workers were constantly praised and acknowledged, the operational staff, the ones in warehouses and factories working tirelessly, were regularly overlooked and neglected. He also noticed that many younger employees, though working incredibly hard, seemed to have no clear path for growth. Determined to uncover the truth, David decided to delve deeper into the departments he suspected were problematic. Today, he would visit the finance department. In finance, David spent his time observing Rachel, the head of the department. She appeared professional and confident in every situation. But something didn't sit right. Despite being in charge of corporate finances, Rachel never directly engaged in monitoring or verifying spending. She merely signed off on reports without taking any steps to ensure the numbers matched reality. While the company had an extremely tight accounting system, it seemed that everything was being hidden under a perfect-looking surface. David continued observing and examining the files that Emma, a financial staffer, was working on. One morning when Emma left her desk to attend a meeting, David seized the moment. He approached her computer. On the screen was a series of financial reports he had never seen before. Large transactions had been executed without any proper explanation. There were unexplained expenses, intercompany transfers, without invoices or documentation. David couldn't stand still. The more he looked at the reports, the more uneasy he felt. The numbers didn't add up. Some transactions appeared intentionally concealed. Though the company had a team of professional auditors, these operations seemed to have been carried out covertly, beyond the oversight of anyone. He continued monitoring. Over the following week, David spent more time carefully watching the staff in finance, especially Emma, whom he now suspected had a role in these shady dealings. She seemed like a hard-working employee, but something in her eyes unsettled him. One afternoon, as Emma left her desk, David quietly followed her. He needed to know what she was doing and whether she was part of whatever was unfolding. Emma entered a closed meeting room. David couldn't see inside, but he was sure something important was taking place. He stood nearby, keeping a safe distance but close enough to catch a few words. "This has to stay between us, Emma," said a voice from inside. It was Daniel, a senior executive David knew well. The two were discussing large expenditures that no one else in the company was supposed to know about. David couldn't make out the entire conversation, but the tone made it clear. There was a serious cover-up happening. Untraceable transactions. Huge sums being moved around without any accountability from upper management. When the meeting ended, Daniel and Emma emerged. David watched them, his heart heavy. He knew he had to do something, but wasn't sure if he could. Could this company really change without his intervention? David returned to his post, more tense than ever. He had to find a way to verify everything, to uncover the truth behind these murky transactions. And if necessary, he would do whatever it took to expose what was going on. David couldn't shake off the thoughts of what he had uncovered over the past few days. The mismatched numbers, the falsified documents, and especially the suspicious exchange between Daniel and Emma haunted him, robbing him of sleep. He knew that to truly understand what was happening, he had to see it from a different angle, from the perspective of the people the company relied on every single day, the nameless laborers. David decided to visit the operations department where employees like Lucy worked. It was a place few paid attention to, a department the company merely considered a cog in the wheel. He understood that only by experiencing their work firsthand could he truly see and grasp the real problems. That morning he disguised himself again, an old button-up shirt, worn jeans, and plain sneakers. He told no one who he really was. Dressed like this, David blended into the crowd of workers in the warehouse, where everything moved at a frantic pace and there was no time to look around. Everyone was focused solely on their tasks, sometimes forgetting their coworkers even existed. In the warehouse, David met Lucy for the first time. She was a hard-working employee, yet she never seemed to receive the recognition she deserved. Lucy was unassuming in appearance, always working quietly and diligently throughout the day. The looks she got from coworkers and supervisors might have been laced with pity, but never respect. She had no prospects for promotion, no voice in meetings, even though she was one of the company's longest-serving staff members. David couldn't ignore her. Lucy was the embodiment of the kind of employee the company seemed to have forgotten. He observed her for several hours as she moved from section to section, hauling heavy boxes and working nonstop. Occasionally, she would pause to wipe sweat from her brow, only to return to her duties moments later, as if this job was all she had. David couldn't help but wonder, why did someone like Lucy have to work in silence and go unacknowledged, while people like Daniel, Emma, and other high-level managers could manipulate the system and live in comfort, indulging in power and privilege? In a brief moment when Lucy paused to get a drink, David approached her. He wasn't sure what to say, but when he looked into her eyes, he saw the exhaustion, an exhaustion born from endless work without proper recognition. "Lucy, can I help with anything?" David asked, trying to keep his tone natural. Lucy looked up at him, a faint smile crossing her face. "I'm all right, just grabbing some water." "Thanks." In her words, David felt both resilience and sacrifice, but also an underlying loneliness. Workers like Lucy, no matter how extraordinary their efforts were, never received the recognition they deserved. These were the people the company, and perhaps many other companies, had simply overlooked. David decided to learn more about her. After the shift ended, he quietly followed Lucy as she left the company. He had no intention of violating her privacy, but he needed to know more. As she spoke about her life, David realized she wasn't just a regular employee. She was a single mother, raising a young daughter, doing everything she could to maintain a normal life in a society riddled with hardship and challenge. Lucy had accepted low wages and long hours because she had no other options. Despite her tireless work, she was consistently ignored by management. Nothing she did was ever truly seen or valued. Once again, a deep sense of injustice stirred inside David. He couldn't sit back and watch people like Lucy continue to suffer in silence. As Lucy finished recounting her exhausting daily routine, David felt an overwhelming sense of guilt, even though he wasn't the one who had caused her suffering. Deep down, though, he understood that if no one stepped up, if people like him didn't take a stand, justice would remain forgotten. David returned to the office the next day, his mind consumed by the encounter with Lucy. He knew what he had seen and heard was only the tip of the iceberg. If the company truly wanted sustainable growth, if he truly wanted to ensure that every employee was treated fairly, he had to dig deeper. He could no longer stand still and ignore the injustices unfolding right beneath his feet. David could no longer wait. After everything he had witnessed and uncovered, the frustration had reached a boiling point. He couldn't stand idle knowing that misconduct, secret dealings, and injustice were taking place right inside his own company. He had to act. But the question was, how? How could he expose the truth without harming the company or innocent employees? And more importantly, how would he confront those who had been manipulating power all along, especially Daniel, the man he suspected of being deeply involved in the company's financial irregularities? The next day, David made the decision to confront Daniel directly. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he couldn't delay any longer. Everything had to be brought into the light. He called for a private meeting with Daniel and Rachel, away from other members of the executive team. It was a confidential session, one David hoped would give him the chance to ask the difficult questions that had been weighing on him. Daniel entered the room with his usual cold demeanor, unaware of the meeting's true purpose. Rachel sat down and opened her laptop, but David couldn't ignore the strange flicker in her eyes, almost as if she were trying to hide something. David looked Daniel straight in the eye, unwavering. "I need to speak with you about some issues in the finance department," he began, his tone calm but firm. Daniel raised an eyebrow, visibly surprised. "What kind of issues?" he asked, feigning a composed attitude, though his eyes betrayed unease. David didn't beat around the bush. "I've seen financial reports that don't match up. It appears some large sums of money have been transferred without any approval from the board. Can you explain that?" Daniel smiled, but it was an empty smile, one devoid of warmth. "I'm not sure what you're talking about. All the reports are clear and have been properly reviewed." David wasn't fooled. "I've seen other documents, ones I wasn't supposed to see. There are large expenses with no approval, no invoices. Why?" he pressed, his voice steady but piercing. The room fell silent. David could feel the weight in the air. Daniel tried to maintain composure but was clearly unsettled. He began to mutter, as if groping for an explanation. "This is just an internal matter. We're just doing our job." "What matter exactly?" David shot back, eyes locked on Daniel. "These operations haven't gone through any proper channels, and I can't allow this to go on." The tension between them escalated. Rachel, who had been silent the whole time, finally spoke. "David, I think we can handle this discreetly. There's no need to make a scene." Her words were carefully chosen, but the hint of concern in her voice was unmistakable. David wasn't swayed. "No, Rachel, this can't continue. This company needs transparency. Our employees deserve to know that things are handled fairly and properly." He turned back to Daniel. "I will not let this company be manipulated by people like you." Daniel's expression changed. He realized this wasn't going to be like previous situations, where he could simply deflect or control the narrative. "David, I don't think you understand the full context. This isn't as simple as you think," he said, his voice growing tenser. David didn't back down. "I understand perfectly. That's exactly why I'm here. It ends now." The room went still. Daniel knew the tide had turned. He could no longer dodge responsibility. Sweat began to bead lightly on his forehead. David had pushed too far, and Daniel knew he couldn't continue hiding the truth. "All right, David," Daniel finally admitted, his tone no longer confident. "I'll tell you the truth, but you have to understand, these decisions weren't easy." David stared him down. "I just want the truth." Daniel sighed and began recounting what had happened. He explained that the money transfers were part of internal deals meant to help the company weather temporary financial setbacks. Though these actions were against policy, he believed they were necessary to maintain company stability. David didn't accept the justification. "There's no excuse for wrongdoing and deceiving our staff," he said firmly. "This has to be addressed immediately." David couldn't stop now. After the intense confrontation with Daniel, he knew that what he had uncovered was just the tip of the iceberg. The illicit relationships, the abuse of power, the shady dealings, these couldn't be undone with a single conversation. He had to go deeper and expose the truth fully. But he also knew he couldn't do it without concrete proof. And the people manipulating power within the company weren't going to give in easily. David's everyday life had become a nightmare. Each day he was forced to face difficult decisions and confront things he had never imagined before going undercover. Beneath the polished suits and the deferential glances from junior staff, he was a man seeking justice, not just for himself, but for all the silent workers holding the company together. David's resolve only grew stronger. He knew that to change anything, he couldn't remain silent and quietly collect information. He had to reveal who he truly was, and this would be the unavoidable turning point. That day, without prior notice, David summoned Daniel and Rachel to a high-level meeting. He had made his decision. He would reveal his true identity, not just to Daniel, but to everyone present. This was the moment he would confront the truth and begin the change the company so desperately needed. Everyone in the room had already taken their seats, their eyes exchanging curious glances. Rachel sat beside Daniel, trying to maintain her composure, but her eyes couldn't hide their unease. Daniel, usually calm and self-assured, could no longer mask the tension etched across his face. David stood up, feeling every pair of eyes fixated on him. He offered a brief smile, but there was no ease in his chest. "I want to begin this meeting with something very simple," David said, his voice low but firm. "What we're doing here doesn't just affect this company. It affects every single worker we are supposed to lead." The room was silent. People sensed something coming, but no one expected David to take it this far. He looked straight at Daniel, unblinking. "Daniel," he began, "I no longer have the patience to watch what's happening in this company, and I know that the problems we're facing stem from manipulation and the lack of transparency in the decisions you've made." He paused for a moment, then continued, "It's time I reveal my true identity." Silence blanketed the room. Daniel looked at him, the confidence draining from his eyes. Rachel sat stunned, unable to conceal her shock. No one could believe what they had just heard. David stepped away from the table and walked toward the window, where daylight streamed in and reflected against the cold walls of the room. "I am David Carter, CEO of Carter Corporation," he said, his voice ringing through the dense silence. "And I've heard everything I needed to hear. What I've seen and uncovered in these past days has made it impossible for me to sit still and look the other way." The room froze. Time seemed to stop. Everyone sat in stunned disbelief at the truth. Daniel and Rachel looked at each other, speechless. No one could have imagined that the man they'd been working with all this time, the one who had seemed unfamiliar and distant during key meetings, was actually the CEO. David turned back to face them. "Why, Daniel? Why did you choose to deceive me, deceive the staff, and hide illegal expenditures? Did you really think you could get away with all of this without being found out?" Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came out. He tried to remain composed, but the tension in his body betrayed him. Rachel and Daniel now sat in silence, unsure how to explain what had just been exposed. A quiet guilt flickered in their eyes, but they couldn't escape the truth David had just laid bare. "What I want to say now," David continued, "is that I didn't just sit and watch. I decided to act. For fairness, for the justice we've forgotten. And now, I'll do everything it takes to make sure this injustice no longer exists in this company." The room had fallen completely silent. David stood tall, unwavering, his eyes filled with conviction. Daniel and Rachel sat frozen, struggling to gather their thoughts after the unexpected shock. Never in their careers had they imagined being confronted like this. Every second that passed only stretched the tension further in the small, closed meeting room. David looked at Daniel once more, no longer with fear or hesitation. He had made up his mind. He would not back down. The truth needed to be brought into the light, and he would not allow his company to be manipulated by those who abused power. It was time to face everything. "Daniel," David began, his voice no longer hesitant, "I want to know everything you've been hiding. Why are there unclear expenses in the financial reports? Why are employees like Lucy and so many others working in the shadows without recognition, while you and others profit from decisions that betray their trust?" Daniel could no longer maintain his air of confidence. He bit his lip, breathing heavily, grasping for words, but all he could do was remain silent. "Fine," Daniel finally said, his tone heavy and defensive. "I'll tell you everything. But you have to understand, these decisions weren't easy. The company was facing serious financial trouble. The funds I diverted were meant to keep the business running." David said nothing, letting the words hang in the air. He had heard this excuse many times from leaders in the past. Tough situations. We had to do it to save the company. They were the same tired justifications for unethical actions. But this time, he couldn't accept them. "You think I'm going to accept that as a reason, Daniel?" David's gaze bore into him. "You think I'm okay with misappropriating company funds and hiding the truth? Using the company as a platform for personal gain?" By now, Daniel was visibly rattled. He lowered his head, glancing at Rachel as if searching for backup. But Rachel remained still, silent. She no longer dared to intervene. The situation had spun far beyond her control. David didn't wait for further explanations. He needed to make it clear what was happening, and he could no longer be fooled by vague excuses or shallow rationales. "I won't let this continue. Your actions won't just tarnish this company's reputation. They're hurting innocent workers who have devoted their lives to this place. In that moment, David realized he wasn't just confronting Daniel. He was confronting himself. He couldn't watch the company crumble under these violations. He had to act. "So here's what I'm going to do, Daniel," David continued, his voice lowering. "I've seen enough. I've heard enough. This company cannot go on living in the shadows. I'm ordering a full audit, top to bottom, and no one in this company will be allowed to interfere with it." Daniel and Rachel had nothing left to say. Every excuse, every explanation they once thought made sense, now rendered meaningless. The secrets they had worked so hard to conceal had been exposed, and there was no way out. David turned toward the window, feeling the tension in the room press against his shoulders. He looked out, where the distant city lights began to flicker beneath the dusk. A world outside the company, unburdened by manipulation or self-serving agendas. He understood now. This battle wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about fairness within the company. It was about how to dismantle a system that had for too long clung to all the wrong things. David wasn't afraid to take on that battle. He had made his decision. His company, his people, deserved better. And he would no longer allow those who abused their power to keep their grip on it. David felt as if the world around him was shifting with every passing moment. After revealing his true identity and confronting Daniel in the boardroom, he realized he wasn't merely facing a financial issue. He was engaged in something far greater, a battle to protect values, ethics, and fairness within the very company he had dedicated his life to building. But this battle was also unearthing shadows the company had long refused to acknowledge. Following the tense showdown with Daniel and Rachel, David knew it was time for bold decisions. The company could no longer operate under this cloud of impropriety. His actions needed to go beyond words. He couldn't stand by and let the company drift deeper into misconduct, not even as its CEO. He needed to show every employee that they were seen, that they mattered. David sat alone in his office, eyes fixed on the pile of documents sprawled across his desk. He knew each decision he made now would ripple through every corner of the organization. He wasn't just dealing with people like Daniel. He had to confront internal fractures that had festered for years. Things couldn't remain as they were. He had to act. And what he did next would shape not only the company's future, but the dignity and careers of its workers. Though the earlier meeting had ended with decisive steps, David felt far from finished. He was standing on a path filled with uncertainty, where each move forward might spark meaningful change or push him into a darkness he hadn't yet prepared for. Even though he had ordered a full audit, he knew it was only the beginning. There was more to uncover. As he sat deep in thought, a knock broke the silence. David looked up, and Lucy entered the room. She wore her work uniform, her hair down, looking tired, but there was strength in her eyes that hadn't dimmed. David noticed the weariness in her posture, but she carried herself with a calm resilience, as though hardship had long been part of her routine. "Lucy, have a seat," David said, his voice gentle, though tension still gripped his chest. Lucy sat across from him, silent, her gaze fixed on him, as if waiting for something. Finally, David broke the silence. "You work incredibly hard, Lucy," he said, hesitating slightly. "But do you feel this company sees your value? That people like you have been forgotten?" Lucy paused, then replied softly, "That feeling has become part of life, sir." She didn't call him David, as if she now fully understood he wasn't just another manager. "We've worked hard for years, but recognition? We're just numbers on a payroll, forgotten names on a list." Her words cut deep. David knew she was right. His company had never given people like Lucy a fair chance to rise. Workers with talent, with dedication, never granted the opportunity to change their own lives. "You don't deserve that," David said, his voice tightening. "You deserve better. You deserve the opportunities you've earned through your work and sacrifice." Lucy looked at him, her eyes shining with a kind of disbelief. "I've grown used to giving without receiving, but if things could change, I wouldn't even know where to start." David reached for her hand, feeling the quiet strength in her grip. "You won't have to endure it any longer, Lucy. I'm going to change that. I'm going to rebuild this company into a place where fairness is the foundation. No one will be overlooked again. I'll make sure of it." They sat in silence for a long moment. No words were needed. David knew Lucy could feel the sincerity in what he said, and he knew he had touched something vital, not just about saving a company, but about restoring faith for those who had been ignored too long. David made a decision that day. He called for a company-wide leadership meeting, not just to inform them of the audit, but to announce sweeping changes he was about to implement. He couldn't allow the company to continue under the same broken systems, where people like Daniel could act without consequences. The meeting room filled with senior staff, buzzing with uncertainty. No one knew the full purpose of the gathering, but when David walked in and met their eyes with resolute clarity, they understood. This was no ordinary meeting. David stood before them and didn't speak immediately. He looked each of them in the eye, reading their reactions. After a long pause, he began. "I've uncovered deeply troubling issues within this company," David said, his voice firm and steady. "And I refuse to sit by while these problems continue to harm our workers. It's time for change, not just in financial accountability, but in how we treat our people. We must ensure every employee has equal opportunity and no one is ever left behind." He turned toward Daniel, who sat nearby, visibly anxious. "You, Daniel, and those involved in these violations will be held accountable. I've initiated a full audit. Every transaction will be reviewed." Daniel froze. Rachel said nothing, but uneasy glances passed between managers. They now understood David wasn't bluffing. His words carried weight and consequences. "To everyone here," David continued, "I want you to understand, this company will change. People like Lucy and so many others will no longer suffer in silence. We will build a fairer workplace, and I promise no one will be forgotten again." David walked out of the meeting filled with unwavering determination. There was no time to pause or rest. Everything had to happen now. Every passing second had the potential to shift the future of the company, and he understood that he could no longer allow those who had manipulated power to continue operating unchecked. Reform could not wait. Immediately following the meeting, he ordered a full-scale audit, something he had never been able to enforce before. He demanded the most professional and independent team of auditors available, working under his direct supervision, to begin combing through every financial transaction and report from the past several years. The murky deals, the unexplained expenses, everything would be brought to light. Though confident in his decision, a part of David remained deeply unsettled. He knew resistance would come. People like Daniel and Rachel weren't going to accept defeat without a fight. They would try to twist the truth, find ways to deflect blame, or disappear into the shadows of plausible deniability. And as long as they held even a shred of power, true change would remain out of reach. That night, David couldn't sleep. His mind spun relentlessly. He thought about his conversation with Lucy earlier that day. She had no choice but to keep working, even while knowing she had been forgotten. She had accepted what no one should be forced to endure. But her resilience, that quiet strength, was what kept David going. She, and workers like her, were the reason he had to see this transformation through. The company couldn't keep operating the way it always had. The next morning, David made another decision. He would hold a private meeting, not with senior executives, but with everyday employees. He wanted to see their faces, to hear their voices. He wanted to listen to stories that had never been told, to truths that had never been asked for. He understood that real reform couldn't come from reports or top-down decisions. It had to come from listening to those who had been enduring in silence. The meeting took place in a small, modest room on the lower floor. David sat at the center, not at a glossy boardroom table, not in a leather chair, but on a simple plastic seat surrounded by others. He wanted to eliminate every sense of hierarchy. The employees, many of whom he had never seen before, began to file in. Their expressions were guarded, cautious, but beneath the uncertainty was a flicker of hope. They didn't know who David really was. Most assumed he was just another manager tasked with reviewing company culture. "Good morning, everyone," David began, his voice calm but resolute. "I'm part of this company, and I want to hear directly from you about the problems you faced here." One employee stood up. "We work hard," she said, "but we never feel acknowledged. Sometimes we can't even survive on what we're paid. But we keep going because we don't have a choice." David looked at her and saw exhaustion etched into her features, but also a stubborn light that hadn't been extinguished. He nodded, feeling the weight of her words. You deserve recognition, he said, and you won't have to keep suffering in silence. The company will change. What was wrong will be made right. Another worker rose, more hesitant. But will anything actually change, sir? We've heard promises before. Nothing ever came of them. David didn't take offense. He understood. I don't expect you to trust me just yet, but I promise I'm going to do everything I can to make sure this time is different. You'll see it. This won't just be talk. I'm standing up for you, and I will bring fairness to this place. The conversation lasted over an hour, and every story David heard only fueled his resolve. These employees didn't just need a better paycheck. They needed to be seen. They needed respect. And above all, they needed fairness. He heard stories of discrimination, mistreatment, missed opportunities, and persistent hardship. But he also heard strength, resilience, humanity. And that, more than anything, was why he couldn't give up. As the meeting concluded, David knew the time for planning was over. The time for implementation had begun. The company needed immediate action. And workers like Lucy, those who had been overlooked and undervalued, needed to be placed where they truly belonged. David returned to his office and immediately began outlining a new operational blueprint. He would start by overhauling the recruitment process, promotion standards, and compensation structure. He also decided to launch a new training and development program designed to ensure that every employee, regardless of rank, had the opportunity to grow and advance. He wasn't just reforming policy, he was rebuilding the company's soul. The company had begun the long-needed transformation, but David knew that healing would not come quickly. It would take time, patience, and most importantly, the participation of everyone. The decisions he had made and the reforms underway weren't just about numbers or long-term strategies. They were about people, about building an environment where every employee felt valued and had the opportunity to grow. Over the following weeks, David worked tirelessly. He met with each department, every team, taking time to listen to their stories. He was no longer just a CEO in a corner office. He was a man on the ground, genuinely invested in the reality of his company. And slowly he began to witness the most critical changes, not flashy, but real. Yet despite this progress, not everyone supported David's direction. Some senior managers remained uneasy with the changes. They doubted whether the reforms would bring lasting results. And worse, they feared losing their power. Daniel was not alone in this sentiment, but he remained the most influential, and the growing rift between him and David felt increasingly unavoidable. David knew he couldn't avoid direct confrontations with these figures. One of the most pivotal conversations, however, was with Lucy, the woman who had come to represent everything he was fighting to change. She wasn't just a hard-working employee. She had become a quiet leader, a symbol of resilience and the voice of those long ignored. David invited Lucy to his office, not to talk about job performance, but to hear her honest thoughts about the company's direction. She walked in with a seriousness in her eyes, calm but contemplative, as though she had been weighing something important. She sat down silently for a moment, then finally spoke. David, she began softly, I have to admit, I didn't think anything would change. I thought we'd just keep going, like always, with no one ever really caring about people like me. But it feels different now. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was firm. The company feels changed, not just in how we work, but in how we see each other. I feel respected for the first time. That's something I've never known here. David felt warmth swell in his chest. He knew change couldn't happen overnight, but Lucy's words confirmed that he was on the right path. Thank you, Lucy, he said gently. I know how much you've endured. You're not just a worker, you're a cornerstone of this company, and I promise you, you'll never be forgotten again. Lucy smiled faintly, though there was a trace of concern in her gaze. I appreciate that, David, but this won't be easy. Big changes never are. Some people won't want to let go of the old ways. David nodded. I know, but I won't back down. We have to change, not just for the company's future, but for people like you. Fairness, respect, and opportunity. Those aren't luxuries. They're what everyone in this company deserves. Their conversation ended not with grand declarations, but with quiet agreement. Yet in David's heart, He knew this moment marked a turning point. This wasn't just about corporate reform anymore. It was about restoring dignity to the unseen, about rebuilding trust from the ground up. He had the support of people like Lucy, and that mattered more than any quarterly report. In the days that followed, the company began to shift in tangible ways. Employees were retrained on values of fairness and mutual respect. Legacy departments were restructured. New hiring and promotion policies were rolled out. But even as these changes took root, David couldn't shake one lingering presence: Daniel and others who resisted reform. The power struggle wasn't limited to the boardroom. David knew that as he pushed for a new culture, those in old positions of power would push back. It didn't intimidate him. It only fueled his resolve. One morning, David called a meeting with all senior managers. As they gathered around the conference table, the tension in the room was palpable. Everyone had sensed the company's shift. The old confidence in the air had vanished, replaced by caution. David stood before them and began, not with a lecture, but with clarity. "This company will not continue as it was," he said firmly. "We are changing, and I want every one of you to be part of that process. We can't go on ignoring our people. We can't keep walking these halls in designer suits pretending we understand what's really going on." He turned to Daniel, who had remained silent from the start of the meeting. "I need you to work with me, Daniel, not to protect your own interests, but to protect everyone's. We cannot keep building a company on injustice." Daniel didn't respond right away, but it was clear he understood. His days of manipulation and evasion were over. He could no longer shift blame for the system he had helped create. David knew the road ahead would be difficult, that resistance would persist, but he had crossed the point of no return. The reckoning had begun, and there was no turning back. After weeks of reform and organizational restructuring, David found himself standing at a critical crossroads. The company was no longer the same place he once knew, but were the changes truly sustainable? Were the financial records finally restored to integrity? Would employees now feel seen and respected as they always should have? David understood that for the transformation to endure, it needed one more push, a bold, collective leap forward. He spent time meeting with departments across the company, listening not just to upper management, but also to the quiet workers in operations, those who had been overlooked for years. He knew that real change wasn't just about policies or workflows. It was about rebuilding trust. People needed to feel that they were part of the change, not just bystanders to it. That day, David organized a company-wide town hall meeting, his first time addressing all staff since launching the reform effort. The goal: to publicly lay out the company's path forward, to hear honest feedback, and, most importantly, to reinforce trust in the process. The hall was packed. Employees from all departments filled the seats. Senior managers sat up front, but David had made it clear: everyone was invited, regardless of position or title. The air was heavy, uncertain. Many employees still carried doubts, unsure whether this new beginning was real. David stepped onto the stage, his gaze sweeping over faces he'd come to know during the past few weeks. He understood that change didn't live in declarations alone. It lived in the hearts and trust of every person in that room. "Good afternoon," he began, calm but firm. "Today, I'm not here just to talk about decisions I've made. I'm here to listen. I want each of you to know you matter. Every person in this company is part of its soul. I've heard your stories, and I promise you, they will not be forgotten." He looked over to Lucy, seated near the back of the room. She didn't smile, but her eyes reflected something deeper: hope. David knew she, and others like her, were the reason he was here. "We've made a lot of changes these past few weeks," he continued, "but this is just the beginning. These changes aren't just about making the company more efficient. They're about making every one of you feel seen, respected, valued." His voice strengthened with resolve. "I commit to fairness. I commit that no one here will be ignored. No one will suffer in silence again." There was a stillness in the room at first, but gradually heads turned, eyes lit up, nods passed between co-workers. Those who had long borne the weight of injustice began to sense something different. A few smiled. Others quietly began to look at David with something he hadn't seen before: belief. Then from the back, a man stood, Mike, a longtime employee who had never spoken at meetings, raised his hand and called out, "David, may I ask something?" David nodded, inviting him to continue. "We've heard a lot of promises over the years," Mike said, his voice steady. "Some of us have been here since day one, and we've seen it all. How do we know this time it's real?" It was a fair question. Not everyone could trust words. Not yet. David didn't deflect or deny the doubt. He welcomed it. He expected it. "Mike, I understand your skepticism," he answered, his tone low but resolute. "You're right to question this. But this time, we won't stop at promises. You'll see it, not hear it. Everything will be transparent. Every step we take will be visible. This change isn't about me. It's about building a company where you can grow, where you matter." The room went silent. David's words didn't just echo, they landed. Mike didn't respond, but his face held a new look. Waiting, watching, hoping. David pressed on. "Every change we make from here on out will be shared openly. You'll be the first to know what's happening. I'm implementing full transparency in every financial decision. No more backroom deals, no more secrets. Every policy will serve the company and its people, not a privileged few." His words weren't just for Lucy or Mike. They were for everyone who had been unheard for too long, for every name buried in a spreadsheet, for every shift worked without thanks. This wasn't just a speech. It was a promise of a new kind of company. As the meeting wrapped, David looked out at the sea of faces. Though the session was ending, he knew the real work was just beginning. They had heard him, but what mattered now was what came next. "Thank you all for being here," he concluded. "This company is changing. You're not just a part of it. You're the reason it exists. Together, we're going to build a better future, one where no one is left behind." As he stepped down and walked toward the exit, sunlight poured through the lobby windows, catching the edge of his suit. He paused for a moment, breathing in the stillness. He knew the challenges weren't over, but change, real change, had begun. And this time, he wasn't going to let anyone stop it. After weeks of difficult decisions and tense confrontations, David began to see the visible effects of change across the company. While the reform process was still incomplete, the initial steps had already sparked real waves of positivity among employees. Departments once neglected were now beginning to feel renewed attention. Workers who had long been forgotten were finally starting to realize they deserved the chance to grow. The financial systems had been thoroughly audited, reports made public, and the company was slowly entering a new era of transparency. David couldn't help but feel proud of the early results. But he also understood that these reforms only mattered if they could endure. Sustainability, not just momentum, was the measure of success. The company couldn't afford to fall back into its old ways, and David couldn't allow people like Daniel to ever hold power again. The fight wasn't over. What had changed, however, was David's own sense of conviction. He no longer felt alone in this journey. He had the support of people like Lucy, once overlooked, now empowered, and they had become the fuel for his persistence. Employees who once had no voice were now stepping into the spotlight, and that, more than anything, told David that the struggle had been worth it. One morning as he arrived at the office, David received a call from a renowned advisory organization that specializes in corporate reform and cultural transformation. They invited him to speak at an upcoming global summit on corporate governance and workplace equity. The invitation felt like more than recognition. It was confirmation that what he had accomplished didn't just matter within his own company, but had begun to ripple outward into the broader business world. He realized that his company had become a model of what change could look like. From a place riddled with manipulation and secrecy, it had emerged into a space where fairness and respect formed the foundation. But to preserve that change, David knew he had to lead by example, not just internally, but outwardly, publicly. He couldn't merely manage a company anymore. He had to inspire others to believe change was possible too. Still, his mind couldn't rest. There were challenges ahead. The reforms were just the beginning. He needed to continue building consensus across all departments. Even employees like Mike, who had once expressed doubt, were now beginning to see things differently. They didn't just believe in him, they believed in the possibility of what the company could become. But one thing David had never lost sight of was Lucy, and others like her. She had worked in a system that never cared about her, but now everything was different. Lucy had been promoted. She had become one of the new leaders in the company. No longer a background figure, she was now a voice shaping the future, a representative of the silent workforce that had carried the company for so long. Watching Lucy step into leadership brought David a sense of fulfillment that no stock price ever could. He knew he had done the right thing. The company wasn't just changing on the surface. It was evolving at its core. One day, as David was preparing for his keynote at the international conference, he received a message he never expected, a call from Daniel. After being dismissed from the company and facing public scrutiny, Daniel had disappeared without a trace. But now he wanted to meet. David didn't hesitate. He knew this could be a chance to understand more deeply, not just about Daniel's actions, but about the culture that had once enabled him. Understanding the past was essential to securing the future. They met at a small cafe downtown. Daniel arrived looking thinner, older. His expression was weary. There was no smugness, no control, just a man with the weight of his choices on his shoulders. Though a trace of pride still lingered in his eyes, something softer had emerged, a vulnerability David had never seen before. "David," Daniel began, his voice low, hoarse, "I didn't expect to face you like this. I know I was wrong. I never imagined things would end the way they did." David sat down across from him, calm. "I don't want to relive the past, Daniel, but I need to know why. Why did you do it? Why deceive the company, your own team?" Daniel looked down, his shoulders sagging. "There's no easy answer," he said. "When things got tough, I panicked. I saw everything slipping away, and I tried to control what I could. But in doing that, I lost everything." David didn't feel anger anymore, only a quiet sense of clarity. He understood now. Daniel hadn't been evil. He had been consumed by fear and ambition, like so many before him. "Your fear wasn't wrong," David replied steadily, "but how you acted made it worse. Integrity is everything, and I think you know that now." They shook hands, not as friends, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement. Daniel had been part of the company's story, and though he had fallen, David's choice to meet him without judgment spoke volumes. Justice wasn't always about punishment. Sometimes it was about understanding, and understanding was the heart of true reform. As David walked away from the cafe that day, he felt something settle inside him. Not closure exactly, but balance. The past had been confronted. The present was being rebuilt, and the future, still unknown, felt like it finally belonged to everyone. A month had passed since David had launched the sweeping reforms that shook the foundation of the company. The gloom that once lingered in the office air had lifted. There was light now, not just from the fluorescent panels above, but from the people themselves. Employees who had once worked in silence now moved with confidence. Those who had been overlooked were now seen, heard, and, most importantly, valued. The company's financials had improved, but more than that, its culture had transformed. David had come to understand, true change is never easy, but it is necessary, and it is always worth it. He stood at his office window, morning sunlight warming the space around him. From that height, he could see the entire city pulsing with life. But the view that mattered most wasn't down below. It was in the eyes of his employees, their renewed sense of purpose. The feeling of success no longer came from spreadsheets or stock tickers, but from seeing workers who were proud to walk through the company's doors each morning. That bright morning, David stepped into the conference room for an internal celebration. Employees from every department were gathered, their eyes not just curious, but hopeful. They weren't just clocking in for work. They were part of something bigger. They were part of a company that had chosen integrity, fairness, and respect over profit at all costs. "Good morning, everyone," David began, his voice calm but firm. "Today is special. Today is a day to say thank you for your work, your patience, and your belief in what we've built together. Every one of you played a role in transforming this company, and none of you will ever be overlooked again." The room stilled. There was no hesitation in the faces before him. The skepticism that once filled these walls had faded. What remained was quiet belief. The changes were no longer abstract. They were real. Policies had shifted. People had risen, conversations had opened, and most of all, the walls of silence that once divided employees and leadership had crumbled. David paused for a moment, letting the weight of the moment settle. We've accomplished so much in such a short time. We've cleaned out what needed to go. We've created fairness where there was injustice. But we're not done. This journey isn't over. We will continue to grow, continue to evolve. Because I believe every person here deserves to work in a place built on respect. Heads nodded, smiles formed. For the first time in years, there was a sense of shared destiny, of forward motion. People no longer feared being left behind. They felt included. They were included. As the meeting concluded, employees rose in applause, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. People like Lucy, once invisible, were now leading teams. David had kept his promise. He hadn't just turned around the numbers, he had turned around lives. A month later, David was invited to speak at a major international conference on corporate transformation. Leaders from top global firms gathered to learn, to share, to rebuild. As David stood on that grand stage before thousands, he no longer felt like an isolated reformer. He was part of something larger now, a movement of leaders choosing people over politics, culture over control. We changed our company, David said, not through financial strategy alone, but by choosing to treat our people like human beings. To truly change an organization, you must begin at the core, and that core is respect. The crowd erupted in applause. They knew that what David had done wasn't just a business case, it was a moral one. A reminder that companies aren't machines. They are made of people. After the conference, David returned to his office with renewed clarity. He looked at the progress made and saw not just reform, but rebirth. This wasn't just a corporate makeover. It was a cultural redefinition, one where every employee mattered. Then one morning, Lucy walked into his office. She looked at him with gratitude and strength in her eyes. "Thank you, David," she said warmly. "You didn't just change my life. You changed all of ours." David met her gaze and smiled. "Thank you, Lucy. You were the reason I did all of this." She was no longer the forgotten one in the warehouse. She was a leader. She was the face of everything that had changed, and she would carry that torch forward. Their story wasn't just about a company. It was about people. It was about trust, about justice, about rediscovering the power of fairness in a world that too often forgets. As David stood once more by his office window, the afternoon light casting gold across the city skyline, he realized something deeper. He hadn't just changed the company. He hadn't just changed himself. He had changed others. And together they had created something enduring. They had not only rewritten the future of a business, they had redefined what leadership should be. And their journey, like all stories of transformation, wasn't ending. It was just beginning. If this story touched you, if it made you believe in the possibility of change, if it gave you hope that dignity still matters in the workplace, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that matters. Share this video with a friend, a coworker, or someone who might need to be reminded that change is possible. Leave a comment below. What did you think of David's journey? Do you believe companies today can become more just, more human? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you for watching until the very end. Remember, every act of courage, every stand for fairness, every voice that refuses to stay silent is a step toward a better world. And we can all be part of that change.